Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I am thrilled to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Daniel Lieberman and Gretchen Reynolds. Thanks for attending. FAN is a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice, among others. We have over 150 videos of past events archived on our website and our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. And now for formal introductions. Daniel Lieberman is the Lerner Professor of Biological Sciences in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. He studies and teaches how and why the human body is the way it is, and how our evolutionary history affects health and disease. He is best known for his research on the evolution of the head and on the evolution of running and walking, which he studies by combining experimental biomechanics, anatomy, and physiology, both in the lab and in the field, mostly Africa, but also Mexico. Professor Lieberman loves teaching and has published over 150 peer-reviewed papers, as well as 3 popular books, including Exercised. The other 2 are The Evolution of the Human Head from 2011 and The Story of the Human Body, Evolution, Health, and Disease in 2013. Gretchen Reynolds is the phys ed columnist for the New York Times. I love her work, and author of the New York Times bestseller, The First 20 Minutes, Surprising Science Reveals How We Can Exercise Better, Train Smarter, and Live Longer. Ms. Reynolds writes for a variety of other publications, including the New York Times Magazine, the Oprah Magazine, Men's Journal, Outside, Parade, Popular Science, and others. And so now let's welcome Daniel Lieberman and Gretchen Reynolds.
Thank you, and thank you, Gretchen. I can't imagine anyone I'd rather, have a discussion with about this topic than you. So thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to be talking to you, Dan. I loved the book, and for anyone out there, if you haven't bought it, you absolutely should. It really is fascinating, and it will definitely get you wanting to go out and move, whether it's walking, running, lifting weights, throwing a spear, whatever it is. You will understand more about why you both want to and don't want to get out and move, which actually, Dan, brings me to my very first question, which is the title of your book. It's called Exercised. Why is it called that? Can you talk us through how you came up with that title and how it encapsulates sort of the theme of the book?
Well, thank you. It's a perfect first question, because the title really encapsulates the basic idea of the book, which is that exercise is of course, everybody knows exercise is good for you. You don't need you or me to know that, but people are confused and anxious and sometimes feel bullied and about the topic. In effect, we've made people exercised about exercise in terms of the way we treat the topic, right? And because we've largely medicalized it and commercialized it, and it's a very strange kind of weird behavior. And so the title of the book is a bit of a pun, but it's also, the pun really has serious meaning, which is that the book attempts to use an anthropological and evolutionary perspective to help us think about this very strange behavior that we participate in places like the United States, exercise, and explore how and why it's healthy, but also how and why people struggle to do it, and why we need to sort of think differently about how to encourage people to exercise, and how to sell it, and how to maybe have a more honest conversation about the topic.
Well, and in terms of sort of our evolutionary history as a species, how unnatural is exercise as an activity, as something we do?
So the very first page of the book is a set of definitions, and I think really the key definition, key two definitions are physical activity, which is just moving, right? Anytime you go out and do anything, wash the dishes, walk to work, walk the dog, shuffle around the house, that's physical activity. But exercise is a special kind of physical activity. Exercise is, I would define as discretionary, voluntary physical activity that we undertake for the sake of health and fitness. And really, it's a very modern behavior, because until recently, people had to be physically inactive in order to survive, to get dinner or to avoid being somebody else's dinner. But nobody went to the gym and picked up weights that they had bought whose sole purpose was to be lifted. Or to me, the apotheosis of how strange exercise is the treadmill, right? And I start the book with treadmill. I mean, think about it. It's such a weird thing, right? You stand on a noisy, expensive machine. You either buy it yourself or you go to a gym where you pay money, to use it, and you work really hard and get nowhere. And it's kind of boring and a little bit dangerous sometimes. And try to explain that to your great grandparents in the Paleolithic. They would think we're crazy, right? To do such a thing, right? So I think that's the key distinction that we have to make. And also, because exercise is such a weird thing, it's something that we're instinctively avoid doing, right? It's an instinct to avoid unnecessary, unrewarding physical activity. And now we live in this world where machines and technology have enabled us to live our lives without moving. And the result is we've had to invent this thing called exercise, and it's hard to do. But of course it's important.
I actually love the story that you do start with in the book, where you bring the treadmill to Africa and try to measure the walking of these women, the tribal women, to see how they walk. And they found it very difficult to walk on the treadmill because that just wasn't normal at all. That's not, is it fair to say that in effect, exercise is our substitute for what once was normal and inevitable behavior, which was, as a species, we had no choice but to be moving, or else, as you said, you either starved or someone else ate you. So how did we get to this point where we do have to exercise?
Well, yeah, it's exercise is really the modern concept of exercise. Of course, the word has changed its meaning over the centuries, but the modern concept of exercise has evolved in pretty much every culture where you have elites, right? So, in the Renaissance, educators realized that, the elites of, the princes and dukes and whatever had to learn to, had to get physical activity because they weren't out in the fields, working. And, but really it was in the same is true in India and China and, everywhere you look. But really it was with the Industrial Revolution and the growth of the middle class that the kind of modern concept of exercise really took root. And you have the gymnasium movement in Germany, and Waterloo being won on the playing fields of Eton, in England, and et cetera, right? Everywhere you go. And so as machines started to replace humans, more and more people had to come up with new ways to be physically active, because of course it's healthy, right? But nearly the things really took off in terms of crisis, starting really in the post World War II era, as cars and public transportation and shopping carts and all the things that we have in our world became so much more ubiquitous that physical activity levels really started to plummet enormously. We have data showing that, we just published a paper showing that guessing that in the United States, moderate levels of physical activity, so when you get your heart rate up to about 50% or more, people are spending at least 30 minutes less per day today than they used to. And other studies have also come up with similar estimates. And that's just because, that's not exercise, that's just physical activity of daily life. And so we've, had to create gyms and treadmills and weights and all kinds of other stuff to substitute for the fact that our bodies expect physical activity. In fact, if you don't move your body, you don't turn on all kinds of repair and maintenance mechanisms that are important for maintaining our health.
I was actually going to ask you exactly that. You mentioned earlier that we know that we have to exercise, but why? I mean, what during our evolution sort of made it necessary that it does sort of underlie health for us, which it doesn't for all creatures. I mean, I have dogs, you have dogs. They're active some of the time and they sleep a lot. I have a cat who I think sleeps 23 and a half hours a day. But we clearly, I mean, there's a lot of evidence and very good evidence. Clearly, we need to be moving for our health. But again, why? How did that happen?
So there's a really interesting story about that, and we don't yet know enough about physical activity in other animals. It's not really been well enough studied. But here's the story with humans, which is that we evolved from great apes. Our closest relatives are chimpanzees, and we're also closely related to gorillas and orangutans. And all of these apes are literally couch potatoes. They have very low physical activity levels. I've had the good fortune to spend time watching chimpanzees in the wild, and they spend half their time just putting food in their mouth. They spend most of the rest of the day just kind of napping. Basically they empty their stomach, put more food in their mouth, empty their stomach, put more food in their mouth. And occasionally they run around and, do other things like copulate and run up and down trees, etc. But for the most part, they do very little. They walk only, 2 to 3 kilometers a day. The average sedentary American walks more than a typical chimpanzee. Have that for a surprising fact. But then after we split from the chimpanzees around 7 million years ago, during our evolutionary history, we became bipeds. And then importantly, we became hunters and gatherers. And hunter-gatherers have to work pretty hard. So measurements by actually some of my former students, Dave Reichlin and Herman Ponzer and others, have showed that typical hunter-gatherers work about 2 to 3 hours a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So that they're not doing crazy amounts of physical activity, but a lot more than your average American, who's doing about 20 minutes a day. So 6 to 10 times more. And that's been going on for millions of years. And in addition, we evolved to live really pretty long lives. Some people think that hunter-gatherers, have nasty, short, brutish lives, but actually, if they survive childhood, they tend to live about 7 decades or more. And importantly, several of those decades are post-reproductive. And in those post-reproductive decades, they're not retiring and going to Florida and putting their feet up and, using golf carts and stuff like that. They're actually staying just as active as they were before, sometimes more. They're digging, they're foraging, they're walking. We have data on this. And that activity, I think, is actually, so natural selection operated on that activity because physical activity is stressful. Right? When you go for a walk or a run or swim or whatever it is you like to do, right? Your mitochondria, for example, the little organelles in your cells that are producing energy, those are spewing out what we call reactive oxygen species, but they're damaging little molecules that wreak havoc everywhere they go. Like they cause mutations in your DNA, they destroy proteins. I mean, they're just bad, right? So we get hot, and so we produce all this heat. We break down proteins, we create little cracks in our bones and our muscles. I mean, we break down our blood cells, we stretch our arterial walls. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on about all these stresses, but those stresses are normal. And so our bodies evolved a whole suite of repair and maintenance mechanisms to respond to those stresses so that, for example, the reactive oxygen species, right? When you produce those, our cells also produce antioxidants, and they produce them in abundance. And we turn on enzymes that repair our DNA and molecules that turn down inflammation and etc. I could go on and on and on, right? And for every single one of those kinds of damage, we've evolved important mechanisms that repair them. And here's the key. We never evolved to turn those mechanisms on to the same extent if we don't stress our bodies. And further, and furthermore, because those mechanisms are so important, we tend to overshoot, right? So the analogy I use is like, imagine you spill some coffee on the floor and the floor is kind of dirty, and then you clean the floor. The floor might be actually cleaner than when you initially, spilled the coffee, right? Because you don't want to, and so one of the key benefits of physical activity is that it turns on all these important repair and maintenance mechanisms that keep us healthy, that keep us from senescing, from aging, essentially. And in the absence of physical activity, we just never evolved to turn those mechanisms on to the same extent because we never evolved to be, couch potatoes like our ape ancestors. So I think that's one of the key reasons that physical activity is healthy.
So in effect, if we aren't getting physical activity, whether it's formal exercise or not, we are not stressing our bodies in ways that, as you say, overshoot the repair mechanism so that they become stronger and healthier. We just miss out on all of those sort of molecular effects that make us stronger and healthier.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Basically. Yeah. I mean, and then, but there's another sort of mechanism too, which by which physical activity is healthy. And this is, I think, the one that most people sort of know about more, which is that, physical activity uses energy, right? And energy today, well, we have energy in abundance, right? If I'm hungry, I can just rush down to the kitchen and there's millions of calories available for me. There's nothing in the kitchen. I can rush over to the supermarket, or there's I'm surrounded by food, right? And in fact, I pay extra money for food that has lower, fewer calories than some other foods. But in the past, calories were limited. People were constrained, right? And they had to make trade-offs. And what physical activity does also is it reallocates how we use energy. And one of the ways it does that is by not allocating energy towards things that are harmful. So when we have excess energy, well, what do we do with it? Well, we store it as fat. And it's no surprise or no secret that too much fat has negative health consequences, especially when it's belly fat, visceral fat. And then the other thing that we do is that, after all, the only thing that natural selection cares about is how many offspring we have who survive and reproduce. It's very kind of grim calculus, but there we are. And so when you're physically inactive, our bodies naturally divert more energy towards reproduction, which in the case of adult humans means either more testosterone if you're a male, or more estrogen and progesterone if you're a female, and those are promote higher rates of cancer. And so physical activity also shunts energy, because we never evolved to be physically inactive. Physical activity sort of shunts energy more towards the kinds of processes that we have, are healthy and normal. And it's really the lack of physical activity that causes our bodies to shunt energy towards processes that might benefit reproduction back in the old days, no longer today, but actually end up being detrimental to health. So there's really kind of two pathways. One is that it prevents bad stuff, and the other is it turns on repair and maintenance mechanisms that help slow aging and reduce our vulnerability to disease. So we often talk about exercise being medicine, but really a better way of saying it is that lack of physical activity makes us much more vulnerable, more susceptible to a wide range of diseases, and increases the rate at which we can senesce.
Well, that leads me into the fact that your book generally is organized around exercise myths, which I find very interesting. And one of them that you discuss somewhat later in the book is that we're supposed to slow down and retire with age, that in effect, we're supposed to stop exercising. But you mentioned already that hunter-gatherers, unless they die in infancy, live easily into their 70s, even their 80s, and they're active that whole time. So is that how we should be, in fact, conducting our lives as we enter the retirement years?
Well, should is a complicated term, but yeah, we call this the active grandparent hypothesis. We just published a paper on the topic, as you know, and
there will be a column coming out about it very soon for those who read the New York Times.
Well, that's great. Well, we're very excited about this paper, and this is with my colleagues Aaron Bagish and Ayman Lee at Harvard Medical School, and two grad students, Tim Kistner and Daniel Richard. But the argument of that paper really is really what we just talked about, which is that we evolved to live long lives, post-reproductive lives, and that physical activity, and that we evolved to be physically active during that post-reproductive lifespan, not only in order to help our offspring survive and reproduce, but also to enable us to stay healthy so we could be physically inactive. In other words, our long health span is not only a cause, but also a consequence of our physical activity. And a way of thinking about that is to make a distinction between lifespan and health span. Now, a lot of what you read in sort of typical studies about health is about health lifespan, right? People talk about how, eating mushrooms affects your lifespan or whatever, right? But until recently, health span equaled lifespan, because health span is how long you live without serious sort of chronic disease. And before modern medicine, which can keep us going when we have, say, diabetes or heart disease or whatever, people would live up until the end of their health span, and then they would die pretty quickly.
Right.
So today, the average American's lifespan is 79. The average American's health span is 63. So we live, we've had this, what's called, the gerontologist James Fries at Stanford has called this extension of morbidity. We've extended our lifespan, but primarily by extending the period towards the end of our life when we're suffering from a wide range of diseases, and we can keep going, and we have all kinds of wonderful medicines and treatments that keep us going, but what physical activity does is it's not so much important for lifespan. I mean, it does have some effects on lifespan. What it really is important for is affecting health span. And it does so by preventing these diseases and by also slowing senescence, keeping your arteries supple. For example, pretty much every medical student is taught that it's normal to get hypertension as you get older. Mm-hmm. That's just like, that's what happens, right? It's like gravity.
Yes, it's inevitable.
Right, but that's not true. We know that not only because there are plenty of Americans who don't get hypertension when they get older, and they tend to be people who, guess what, are physically active. Diet also has an effect. But also we know that we've known this for a long time from studying non-Western populations that don't live modern Western lifestyles and remain physically active. They live to their 70s, 80s, and 90s without any increase in their blood pressure. The first study, for example, there's a very famous study published in 1972 of the hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari, and the 80-year-olds had blood pressures of 120 over 80, and same as the 20-year-olds. So we've known this for a long time. So it's not inevitable that the best way to maintain. One of the best ways to prevent hypertension is to be physically active, because when you're physically active, it causes your arterial walls to remain supple. It causes you to produce more capillaries and small little arterioles, these little arteries that decrease peripheral resistance, so your blood pressure remains low. It keeps your heart strong, and et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of benefits to it. We know them, and so I think studying how these processes works help us realize that a lot of the diseases of aging that we think about aren't diseases that are caused by age. They're diseases that occur as we get older to a large extent because of the way we live. And physical activity is not the only thing. Diet is obviously important. Stress is obviously important. But physical activity is, I think, undervalued sometimes, partly because it's kind of masked by healthcare. The effects of absence of physical activity are masked by healthcare.
Well, so does some of that suggest that our definition of both normal aging and possibly even normal health may be skewed now by how inactive people are? And so we define normal as what happens to someone who's inactive, as opposed to what might be both normal and possible among people who remain physically active throughout their life.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's a leading question because you know the answer,
right? It's absolutely a leading question.
Which is that, of course. I mean, a classic example of that is hearts, right? So when people started studying hearts of athletes, they came up with this term, the athlete's heart. Which and athletes, people who exercise a lot, particularly runners, for example, right, have enlarged ventricles. That's the chamber of the heart that pushes blood throughout either to your lungs or throughout the rest of your body, and they're also a little bit thicker because the walls have to be stronger. And when you compare those kind of hypertrophic hearts to quote unquote normal hearts, which are sedentary people think, oh my God, their hearts are enlarged, right? But actually, turns out that the athletes' hearts are actually the normal ones, and it's the sedentary individuals who aren't physically active who have slightly abnormal, non-enlarged ventricles because they're not using their cardiovascular system as we evolved to use them. And so, there are plenty of other examples. Another example is coronary calcification, right? So there are little if you're worried about coronary heart disease, right, you might get a scan, and when you get plaques in your coronary arteries, there's a little calcium in them, and that shows up, lights up on a CT scan.
Right.
And it is a marker of your risk for a heart attack. But it turns out that people who are very physically active also get little calcifications, but those calcifications aren't the same kind of calcifications. They're actually repair mechanisms for, just using your heart, for the turbulent flow that occurs in those arteries. And so, there's some, world-class runners who have no chance of getting heart disease at all. I mean, they're not going to get a coronary, and they have outrageously high coronary calcification scores, and by the standards that we use, there's something wrong with them, right? But actually, they're actually normal hearts. But based on what doctors see and who the normal population is, quote unquote, they think that those are abnormal hearts. And so we kind of we live in a world where, another example is shoes. Like people, I like to, I've been very interested in barefoot running. That's kind of got me a lot of attention. Not always good, but people talk about how abnormal it is to run barefoot, but for millions of years, nobody had shoes. It's wearing a shoe is actually, from an evolutionary perspective, abnormal. And I'm not saying that, there's nothing wrong with it. I wear shoes most of the time. Not having calluses, for example, is abnormal from an evolutionary perspective. So we've kind of, in our modern world, which we think is normal, it actually isn't normal. My colleague, Joe Henrich, talks about weird people, right? Weird stands for Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. We think weird people are normal, but actually we compromise only about 10% of the world. Most of the world isn't weird, and for most of human evolutionary history, nobody was weird.
Well, you led into one of the other topics I wanted to talk, which is the role of running and walking in the evolution of our species, partly because you're very well known for your research into that. But sort of at this point, based on what what you talk about in the book, what role did running and walking play in our evolution? And what does that mean for us today? Should we all be doing marathons?
Well, first of all, walking is the most fundamental. I mean, we are walkers. That's what we evolved to be. When we split from the chimpanzees, we became bipeds and we became walkers. Your average hunter-gatherer female walks 9 kilometers a day. That's about 5 miles. The average hunter-gatherer male walks something like 13 to 15 kilometers a day. That's like 9 or 10 miles every day. And there are no weekends, there's no holidays, there's no retirement. That's what they do every day throughout their lives.
But they're not doing 5-minute miles, right?
No,
they're walking.
They're mostly walking, right? And that's what you have to do. And so that's like walking from LA to Washington, DC every year, right? That's just normal. That's what we evolved to do. And so there's no question that the most fundamental physical activity, and they're also often carrying things, by the way, when they're walking, but the most fundamental physical activity that we evolved to do is to walk. And so that's why walking is it's the bedrock of every kind of physical activity. But we also evolved to occasionally run, and running became important in our evolutionary history, probably around 2 million years ago, in order to hunt. But we weren't running marathons. I mean, we never evolved to stand on one line and run as fast as possible to another line 26.2 miles away, right? I mean, that's just weird, right? And what we did evolve to do was to run to scavenge or to run to hunt. And they were, probably like half marathon distances, often half walking, half running. The speeds that we've measured people doing that kind of running is it's like a 10-minute mile. They're just kind of jogging, what we would call jogging, right? And they didn't do it every day. They did it, probably once a week. So we're able to do incredible things. We're able to run marathons. We're able to run ultra marathons. But you don't need to do that in order to be healthy. And in fact, there's no evidence that level of physical activity is that beneficial. If you look at the dose response curve to physical activity, right? If you measure sort of dose on the x-axis and how many, its effects on your lifespan, for example, on the y-axis, if you just a little bit of physical activity drops that curve precipitously. So by the time you get to 150 minutes of exercise a week, which is just 5 times a week for 30 minutes, right, of just like brisk walking, you've lowered your relative risk of death by about 40%, right? 30 or 40%. And if you keep doing more, it kind of flattens out, right? And there's really, if you do ultra marathons, you're not going to live that much longer than the person who just kind of runs every once in a while. You're not going to also die earlier either, as some people claim. But it essentially, some is better than none, and eventually the benefits tail off. And that's about it. And so you don't need to run marathons or swim the English Channel or, do CrossFit or triathlons or whatever. I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing those things, but that's not necessary. And that's not what our ancestors did. Like us, they mostly sat around, but they also were, moderately physically active. And surprise, surprise, that turns out to be just kind of what the doctor prescribes, right? If you actually were to listen to your doctor's prescription.
You run marathons. Do you,
I do.
why?
I do because I like the training, but I also don't think that, I don't think that make me healthier than if I said ran half marathons or just kind of ran. I do because I like the challenge. And at my age, I feel like it helps me fight the aging process and kind of, I like the community aspect of it. I like the fact that they raise money for charities, but I don't think there's anything, I don't think that the amount that I do is extra beneficial.
Yeah. What about the whole issue of barefoot running, which seems to have faded somewhat, with shoes now being replaced by the super fat heels, which is another topic. But do you still think there are sort of correlations between running form and injury, and does it matter? Or, do we generally choose the most efficient and least injurious form for each of us?
Well, I don't think there's any good evidence to support that idea. I mean, I think running is a skill, just like every other activity. Swimming is a skill, and playing tennis is a skill, and climbing a tree is a skill, and throwing is a skill. I mean, all kinds of things we evolved to do are skills, and running is no different. And I think that for me, it's always been that what I think is important about barefoot running is that it helps us understand how the body evolved to run, right? We didn't evolve to run in cushioned shoes with all kinds of fancy technology, and then we evolved to run barefoot. And so we learned something about running form and natural running form from barefoot running. And so I think you can run well in a shoe, and you can run terribly barefoot. But what barefoot running does is it helps us to some extent learn to run better, because one thing you can't do when you run barefoot is to crash into the ground, to slam hard into the ground,
right?
That hurts, right? So and barefoot runners don't hit hard, right? You can't. They tend to do what's called a forefoot strike or a midfoot strike, which doesn't create an impact peak. And we published this paper years ago explaining the biomechanics of that. And when you don't slam hard into the ground, you don't have this impact wave that goes up your body and causes what's called medial tibial stress syndrome, or shin splints, is the colloquial term, right? Which can turn into a fractured tibia eventually. But it's not the only skill in running. I think to me that the key to running well is to learn not to overstride, not to stick your leg out too far when you run, and to run at a good cadence. And barefoot running, for the most part, teaches people to do that. I mean, not necessarily. And so for me, the key thing is to learn that is that how you run is what matters, not and that's the most important thing. But what you wear on your feet can affect how you run. And so I think, to me, that's always what I cared about in terms of the barefoot running research that we did. But of course, it turned into a kind of a silly thing, as a lot of things in exercise science, so completely out of my control. All of a sudden, it became like barefoot running is good or bad, which is never anything that I thought about. Or it's like there were like one group of people who were thinking that barefoot runners were like, they're all like polygamists, and there's like marrow, cannabis smoking, whatever. And then there's another group of people who think that people who wear shoes are like corporate tools who are embedding their feet in coffins, and it got totally polarized. There are plenty of people who wear shoes that are just fine, and there are plenty of people who are barefoot and they're just fine. And really it should be about having fun and enjoying yourself and learning about how your body works. And the fact that some people are so scared of it tells us how out of touch we are with our bodies. But also it turned into a lot of virtue signaling, one way or the other. And I was surprised by how it all turned out. And I'm glad that it's all kind of calmed down. But hopefully what we did do is we inspired a lot of research, which is still ongoing, about, biomechanics of running and impact peaks and foot strike and cadence and whatever. And all that's going on. And that was the reason we did it. And so in the long run, I think what really matters is how we end up using that information to study running form, which is like everything else, it's a skill.
Well, and you mentioned that it should be fun. I wanted to ask you about sort of the whole idea of exercise or physical activity as play and how important that is both for motivation, for health, just for anything related to getting us to want to move. How important is it to have fun?
Well, I'm glad that you asked that, because I argue in the book there's really two things that really, we evolved to be physically active for two reasons and two reasons only. One is when it was necessary, and the other one was socially rewarding, right? And we live in a world where it's no longer necessary, so we have to kind of make it necessary for ourselves. And one of the ways to make it necessary but also rewarding is to do it socially, right? So I have some friends who I run with. One of my running buddies is also a collaborator, right? And he lives just a few blocks from me, Aaron Bagish, and we often arrange to meet early in the morning. And usually the night before, it seems like such a great idea. Oh yeah, I'll meet Aaron at 6 o'clock in the morning. And then at 6 o'clock in the morning, it's dark and it's cold. And I don't want to get out of bed. I'm much rather be, in bed with my wife than out on the corner waiting for Aaron. And usually we're very grumpy at first, and but after a few miles we warm up and are always glad that we did it. But that social thing makes it rewarding. And it also gives me a reason to do it, because otherwise I'd leave him out on the corner and all that sort of stuff. And I think that's and there's so many other ways in which people make physical activity social, play, sports, dancing, walking with a friend. And I think the more that we can figure out ways to promote physical activity as a social thing, as opposed to something you do, solitary on a treadmill with, your earpods in, so you're listening to a pod, which is nothing wrong with that, but that's not all that rewarding for most people. The more that we can make physical activity fun and rewarding through things like dance, I think the more we'll help people be physically active. I think that the good analogy for how to think about exercise is how we think about education, right? Education is another weird modern thing that we never evolved to do. Nobody evolved to read. Reading is a completely modern thing, right? Nobody evolved to learn calculus or algebra or all the things we learn in school, right? So how do we make it work? We make it necessary. We make kids go to school, right? And we make it necessary for your career, but we also make it rewarding. School is fun. You meet your friends and you can sports, and there's all kinds of art activities you can do. And so I think the more we treat physical activity like education, I think the more that we'll succeed in helping folks.
Although one of the other sort of main threads in your book is how not unwilling, but almost uninterested we are naturally in moving, in part, presumably because it was important during our evolution to sit as much as possible so that you rested and didn't burn extra calories. I think one of the other myths is that it is unnatural to be indolent, but it's not, right? I mean, which is a real problem for us now when it's so easy to sit, right?
Yeah. I mean, those we've all, I love this. Those when you have like a stairway next to an escalator, right? And people have measured this all around the world. I kind of naughtily did that at the American College of Sports Medicine annual meeting once. But no matter where you go, Israel, United States, Denmark, Sweden, Japan, wherever you have an escalator next to a stairway, unless it's like a crazy long stairway, right? Still about 95% of people prefer the escalator. Even people who study the importance of exercise. So, and that's just normal. It's an instinct. You probably don't even think. It's an instinct. Oh, hey, I can save some energy. I'll just take the escalator, even though there were no escalators, obviously, in the Stone Age, right? And so we now live in this world where there are just so many opportunities for us to avoid physical activity, and that instinct is just always going to be there. And we just don't even think about it anymore. Like, just think about here I'm drinking, I've got a glass of water, right? And how did I get this water? I went to a tap and I just turned the tap, right? It's like magic. But, until recently, if you wanted water, somebody had to go to a well and pump the water out of the well and then schlep it to the house. And every bit of water was a huge amount of work, and we just don't even think about that anymore. When I go shopping, there's a cart, I don't have to carry anything. I don't have to dig anything out of the ground. I don't have to hunt my meat. Well, I don't eat meat, but anyway, we just, and it just seems normal to us, but those instincts to make life easier seem normal to us, but it just helps to stand back and think, oh, actually, that's actually kind of weird, actually, what I'm doing. And maybe that helps people to find ways to be more physically active without all the blaming and the shaming and the whatever. Because, when we tell people that they're lazy for taking the escalator, what we're saying is, there's something wrong with you, but actually their instincts are just quite normal. I think it's the same with, the way we often treat obesity. It's hard to lose weight. We never evolved to lose weight. And it's an instinct to go for the chocolate cake instead of the carrot, right? And we shouldn't blame people for that. We need to find compassionate ways to help people make healthy choices in a world that presents us with a lot of unhealthy choices.
Well, you mentioned weight, and realistically, a lot of people both want exercise to help them lose weight and start exercising to lose weight. But the relationship between exercise and weight loss is really complicated. And you talk about that in the book, but what would you want people to, from your perspective, what would you want them to know about what we know at this point about how exercise affects both weight loss and weight control?
Yeah, well, you've covered this so well over the last years, and it's, of course, as you know, it's a complicated, ongoing story. But look, as we know, if you want to lose weight, and there are a lot of people in our country who want to lose weight, a large percent, actually, a majority of people want to lose weight. It's not the best way to lose weight, because if you run for 5 miles, you'll burn about 500 calories if you're a typical person, right? And then you come home and you can quickly ingest 500 calories just with a drink or two, right? If you want to go into what we call negative energy balance, that is spending fewer calories than you're taking in. Diet is a more effective way of doing that, because you can just a few pieces less, you just avoid the bacon and whatever, you're going to remove 500 calories from your diet very quickly. That said, I think sometimes we undervalue the importance of exercise for weight control and for weight loss. So for a lot of experiments that look at exercise and weight loss, look at the standard 150 minutes a week that's prescribed by the WHO. And sure enough, and you've written about this, 150 minutes a week just doesn't do it, right? You're not going to lose any weight at 150 minutes. You double that to 300 minutes a week, which is still not a huge amount. That's, that's an hour a day, 5 times a week of walking. Not anything close to what a hunter-gatherer does. You actually will lose weight. You're not going to lose a lot, but you'll lose some, and you'll lose it slowly, and you'll lose it gradually. And if you do even more, you'll lose more weight. But and there's some compensation, and there are complicated things going on. But plenty of studies have shown that you can lose weight exercising. But more importantly, the key thing that we've seen over and over and over again is that what exercise does is it helps prevent weight gain and weight regain. So when people lose weight on a diet, it often comes rushing back. And exercise helps prevent that. And exercise also perhaps helps prevent people from gaining weight in the first place. And we don't know all the mechanisms by which it does that. That's still a subject of a lot of really interesting research. But that's pretty well studied. And furthermore, regardless of weight, there's no question that the physical activity, the exercise, has all kinds of other benefits. And so it seems to me that anytime anybody's embarking on a weight loss program, there's, first of all, no harm to the exercise. There's only benefit, and the two complement each other. And the exercise also will help your cardiovascular health. It'll help your metabolic health. It'll help your, it's also important for mental health. You know, we should talk about dopamine and serotonin and BDNF and all the good stuff that's turned on by exercise that is relevant to, for example, Alzheimer's. If the one thing, if you're worried about Alzheimer's, nothing comes close to exercise in terms of helping prevent Alzheimer's. So why wouldn't you include it? You know, it doesn't, you know, it shouldn't be an either or, it should be an and.
Well, you mentioned different amounts of exercise. And one of the things that you talk about in your book is there an absolute dosage? And we have all these prescriptions, the 150 minutes, 10,000 steps, the famous 10,000 steps. But at this point, it's pretty clear, isn't it, that in effect, doing something is better than doing nothing. And it doesn't really matter that there's no absolute magic number that people have to be achieving every day in order to be healthier.
Yeah. I mean, I like that's part of the problem with medicalizing exercise. We think like, you know, you need X milligrams of this drug, you know, for the effect. And we think of exercise as medicine, but it doesn't work that way, right? As I said before, you know, the real thing is that lack of physical activity makes us more vulnerable to disease. And really what we're doing is replacing the physical activity that we used to have in our lives that was necessary for survival with exercise, which is valuable for health. And so there never is going to be an optimal amount. And that's just make believe, right? There's, you know, and it's going to depend on, you know, and the effects are going to depend on who you are. What's your age, your sex, your, you know, your previous health history, your whether you're worried about heart disease or you're worried about cancer. Do you live in a suburb? Do you live in a city? Do you have a lot of money? Or are you struggling? You know, all of these things are going to affect how you can be active and the ways that you can do it, and what's the optimal, you know, what are the ways in which you can be physically active. And there never is going to be, it's not like there's a U-shaped curve where there's a perfect amount, and if you just hit that perfect amount, you're going to be optimally healthy. That's just make believe. And anybody who sells that is a bit of a charlatan or self-deluded, right? It doesn't work that way. So I think what we need to do instead is help people understand that, as you said, you know, if you're physically inactive, just a few minutes a day will improve your health. And if you can do more, that's even better. And even more will have yet more benefit. And eventually those benefits will tail off, you know. And maybe if you do ultra marathons, you might be, you know, increase your risk of atrial fibrillation or something like that. But for the most part, you know, we're not really worried about those people at the very end of the spectrum. They're going to do their crazy stuff anyway, but there's so few of them, it doesn't really matter, right, from an epidemiological perspective. So let's stop thinking about exercise as something that's optimal. That's a medicine that can be prescribed. It's just a continuum. And if we sort of think about it more from an evolutionary and anthropological perspective, we can get away from this sort of medicalized way we think. And that's really the reason I wrote the book. And that's why I entitled it Exercised. You know, we make people confused and anxious about it by making them think there's an optimal amount. And I have to do the optimal amount. And I have to do X amount of high intensity interval training, which is good, by the way. And I should do I should do 3 weight training sessions a week. Well, you know, I mean, with 12 reps, 5 times, you know, I mean, it gets kind of crazy.
Well, the fact that you brought up your book, brought it back around to the book again, it's a very elegant way for me to say, I think it's time, if we do have questions, to open it up to any additional questions from the audience, if we have any.
We do have a couple. Thank you so much for a great interview, Gretchen. We really appreciate it. It was Professor Lieberman. I know that you have so much. The book is big. It's got lots in it. There's lots of appendices. There's notes. There's charts. There's graphs. It is such a great read. I want to make sure that folks know that. Lots and lots and lots to learn in it. We very much love the book. A reminder that we're going to do an after hours at the conclusion of this Zoom. We're going to give Professor Lieberman a 5-minute break in between the Zooms. So we put in chat right here a link to go purchase the book, and then you can come into after hours After hours is nice and casual. Cameras are on. You get to ask your own questions. It's a lot of fun. So we have a couple questions in the Q&A. So let's pivot. Let me first ask we'll ask the most popular question tonight from Deborah. She says, please talk about motivation. Have you studied effective motivations to exercise other than knowing the reasons why it's good? Do you have some research about motivation?
Great question.
What would be effective to motivate yourself?
Yeah, so it's actually a kind of a depressing literature, and Gretchen can second me on that. You know, there's been lots and lots and lots of studies trying to get people to be more physically active, and they rarely do you get a big effect. Usually it's kind of small incremental effects, and I think part of that is that again, we try to prescribe it and we try to medicalize it, and we try to sell it, and it only goes so far with a lot of folks. And I think that it's time to try some new approaches, and in general, the approaches that seem to work the best are the ones that are social. Right? When you make it social and you make it fun, and you have a commitment to other people, or you have other people who are supporting you, those are the ways in which people end up being most successful. And so I think that if you make the motivation about your relationships with others and how you interact with others, that can be really extremely effective. So instead of thinking I'm going to go for a run, you think, oh, I'm going to go meet my friends, and we're going to be physically active when we meet, and that's so much more rewarding, right? And more fun than oh my God, I'm going to go sweat and feel miserable, right? So I think those are the studies that use social means to promote physical activity are the ones that are most effective.
When I was researching some of your work prior to tonight, I think I saw an interview and you drew a distinction that resonated with me, which was one about there's fitness and there's exercise, and that, overweight people can be fit. There can be underweight or normal, we'll call normal weight, typical weight people who are not fit. And so if you kind of separate a little bit of that, that you're aiming for a fitness goal that may not necessarily be connected to weight loss. I think the weight of weight loss hanging over your head, are you losing weight? How much weight have you lost? When did you last weigh yourself? How much did you lose this week? Oh gosh, I gained a pound. I mean, that whole psychological wheel that you get on, if it's more like, I'm going to not even think about weight loss, I just want to be more active, hence ultimately more fit, is kind of a nice on-ramp to engaging in the behavior as well, when it's not so much about immediately metrics and immediately pounds and immediately charts, and you're doing well, you're not doing well, you fell off the wagon. It gets very mentally vicious internally,
Oh, I vigorously agree. I mean,
I think I'm
exercise
badly quoting you, but yes.
No, but tying exercise if making it all about weight loss is it's such a shallow, terrible way of thinking about physical activity. Yes, it can help with weight loss, but not, as we've talked about earlier, it's not the best way to lose weight anyway. Its benefits are there's so many other benefits, and if it does help you lose weight, great. But but that shouldn't be the reason people do it. And if you tie it to weight loss, you're just going to get disappointed. And there was a big debate. Gretchen covered this a lot. The fat but fit debate.
Yes.
And that debate kind of got twisted out of proportion, because
it's a terrible phrase.
It was a terrible phrase, and instead, the real purpose behind the research was to point out just what you said, which is that, independent of weight loss, there are benefits to physical activity, and doesn't mean that weight doesn't matter. It does, and that's what people got upset about. And as a result, I think that the key kind of arguments of that debate got lost.
Gretchen, did you want to add anything about motivation for exercise from all of the course, the research and the writing you do?
I actually read tomorrow's column, which is partly about a big new study of motivation. But often when people ask me, and I'm not trying to be facetious here, the thing that motivates me more than anything else is I have 2 dogs, and that's my social activity. And also, if you want to see fun from physical activity, you go with dogs. They're having a blast. They're doing intervals. They run, they stop, they sniff, they turn around. They're just thrilled. It's a real reminder that being in motion can be joy. And you tend to forget that when you say, I have to go exercise. I do think if it's possible, and I'm not suggesting everyone go get a dog, but if it is possible to reframe that time as your opportunity to enjoy yourself, go for a walk, as Dan said, with your friends, and it's an opportunity to be with your friends. The walking is almost superfluous, and then it really is about pleasure. And I do think that's really is key to activities that you'll stick with.
Thank you for that. We think maybe we have made time for one more question, and it's an important one. From Julie, she asked, how does exercise help depression or anxiety?
Oh gosh, that's such an important question. In fact, I think it's one of the sections of the book that I really felt really passionate about, was that there's a ton of evidence. And again, Gretchen has written a lot about this. I mean, I know I keep saying that, but it's true, because she really had, nobody writes more about this stuff than Gretchen, but so you should pipe in. But there's, physical activity turns on all kinds of neurotransmitters in the brain. You promote the promotion of dopamine and serotonin and epinephrine. You create neurotrophic factors called like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BNNF. There's all kinds of other things going on. It promotes blood supply to the brain, and these effects have been shown to, in study after study. I mean, there are meta-analyses now of huge numbers of individuals showing that physical activity, just moderate levels, have really as effective as many pharmaceuticals in terms of treating and preventing, for example, depression. It's a little less effective with anxiety. And we kind of understand the mechanisms. There's a lot of data. Now it's not a magic bullet, and it doesn't necessarily substitute for other treatments, and so they can be used in conjunction. But remember, a lot of people don't have access to mental health care in many parts of the world, and so I think it should be part of our armamentarium for mental health, physical activity. And again, it's not a secret. People have known that sound mind, sound body relationship has been known for centuries, and the science behind it is increasingly clear, and yet here's a scary statistic. According to the American Psychological Association, only about 30% of mental health care professionals prescribe physical activity for people who are suffering from mental health, and that should change. We need to again, I'm not saying it's a magic bullet, but it should be part of the way in which we help each other.
Gretchen, you want to add anything as we close out the webinar to that particular point?
I agree with everything Dan said. The only thing I would add is that there has been some good, if preliminary, evidence related to being physically active during COVID that does suggest that people who manage to stay physically active, and there was a big drop off worldwide in physical activity, but that people who did manage to maintain some regular, exercise, physical activity routine did have much better mental health outcomes. They were less likely to get depressed. They did feel more resilient in the face of really severe strain, which all of us were under during COVID. So as we continue with the COVID winter, it's one more really good reason to just go for a walk. It really may help you deal with the stress of this situation now.
And I got to add quickly, that there's also studies showing that there was a Kaiser study that Bob Salas published showing that people who got 150 minutes of physical activity a week were also 2.5 times less likely to die from COVID than those who didn't.
Whoa,
There's also
you
some
saved
evidence
that for the 801 hour. That's a big stat right there.
That study didn't get the publicity it deserved.
I wrote about it.
I know you did, but I'm not, that's why we're here.
That's right. Gretchen, thank you so much. It's been a delight hosting you. I hope you remember us when your book comes out, your next one in a couple of years. And honestly, we don't have to wait that long. Happy to host you on the first 20 minutes as well. I'm just putting that in your ear now that I have your email. Watch out. Daniel, thank you so much.